Hi. Hey, this has been so good for me, by the way. Um, I know a lot of my thoughts are really disjointed if you've watched any previous videos. But this has been such a good practice. Every day I've wanted to research more, write better notes, consider what I'm doing in advance, and been really activated by the process rather than something I feel obliged to do and something that is a struggle. I feel actually really activated and lucky that I get to be doing this, that I have the time. So I wanted to show you two books on my reading list right now. We'll be talking about these in the future. For now, I plan to just be doing deep dives into some books and how they inspire me to be thinking about the world. Today, I'm going to be considering the book and film Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, who wrote the book. Also, an article which I'm going to read at the end, so you don't have to listen to the last few minutes if you'd rather just click on the link and read the article called "The Endgames of Bad Faith Communication." So I'm definitely guilty of some of these bad faith communication techniques, and we're going to talk more about that. Ender's Game was a book that I was given to by my uncle. I was probably 11 years old when I got it. I'm not sure that it was written expressly for young children, but the main character is a 6-year-old boy, and we watch him grow up quite a bit. And I found it really interesting. I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time. It's one of my favorite childhood books anyway. I have considered it for over nearly 30 years now, since I first read it back in the 90s. So it was written about 10 years before I read it. And the book, I just started listening to it again on audiobook format because I was wanting to do chores, and I actually couldn't even find my physical copy of that book. It's one I very easily could have given to somebody just to share. I do lose a lot of books that way, but I think it's great in a sense. I always thrift books anyhow. And now that practice has paid off because I was a reader growing up. And then I just became a hoarder of books that didn't read for a long time. And now I'm really motivated to be reading again, reading with my daughter every day, my son every day. It's taking me back to those times when I was a child, and it's really reactivated my love of reading, and especially rereading the stories I thought I knew. So I actually haven't completely re-listened to Ender's Game or rewatch the film. So I think I'll do a future deep dive specifically on Ender's Game. But right now I just wanted to talk about some of the themes in it, and it will be a spoiler, but that's okay. So HBO Max just added Ender's Game to their streaming service. Today's March 1st, 2022. And first thing this morning, my husband mentioned he was going to watch it. And I am like most book people. I don't like the film as much as the book usually. But it's pretty interesting. He's, he wanted to watch this movie, even though it's kind of bad. And he knows that he wanted to watch it. And I thought, hey, that is so funny because I've been wanting to talk about Ender's Game. So, in short, I asked Zev what he thinks about the movie after he watched it again, and he's like, well, pretty bad. But I feel like that's what's already happening. That was his take. And that's all I've been thinking about for over 20 years. Since I was 12 years old, I thought, holy crap, they're gonna be doing this. So, in the world of Ender's Game, kids are being monitored to be able to join this elite space army school. There's been some kind of alien war that the whole Earth knows about. You also find out that the number of children that are allowed to be born to any family is limited to 2, and Ender happens to be a 3rd child, and he's monitored for a longer time than most children. So his older brother is really jealous because his older brother didn't qualify for this program, and he's really mean. And I won't go too much into this actually, because there's really just one quote from the book which gives the perspective of the people monitoring Ender. And so this is where the film just veers right off from the very beginning, is this book goes right in to it alludes from the very beginning to the darkness of this society, this culture. And that is alluded to by a quote from the guys who have been monitoring Ender for 3 years through like a direct tap into his brain so they can see what he sees, they can hear what he hears. They live through his perspective with this technology, this integrated kind of technology, which for most kids, they remove it after a much shorter time. But Ender's had this monitoring going on for years. And so these guys say, we're the Wicked Witch. We promise gingerbread and we eat them alive. So that is sort of my end to this introduction to Ender's Game. Where it leads me to is some other thoughts. But basically, you just see how evil and brutal this world is. And you really have to read the book to understand it. You're not going to get that part necessarily from the film version, I don't think. But again, I'm going to do a deeper dive and analyze these things. But it's like this society is a collective which is preparing for this violent fight. So you presume that like society is all maybe a little bit patriotic, and that's where this book comes in, because this is all about the 1900s and the pomp and circumstance of patriotism at that time. So you can see how this collective force kind of tells a narrative about what we're all about. And this society is all about preparing our kids to train for this potential, you think, defense from an attack, perhaps. But to spoil the whole film, Ender's tricked. And while he thinks he's in training and working on a simulation, he destroys an entire species. And it was at the hands of not only lying to the kids, but lying to the entire society. In my view, that they're on the defensive rather than the offensive. And so that sort of, I think, relates to what may be going on now. Not to say there aren't horrible atrocities actually happening, but in terms of the narratives, what we're being told And then, you know, what's the real game? Okay, and there's all of this. This is always in our media. This is, and we have so many stories about this. But you know, I was enlightened to a concept I never was aware of before, which is a Carl Jung idea that, you know, UFOs may be a manifestation of this collective consciousness. And I had never heard that before today. And I've been doing deep dives down the rabbit hole in every direction just to see about people's different perspectives. You know, what activates them? What are people making YouTube videos about? There's always the weird lights in the skies and the, you know, the preppers and the um, um I said to my daughter, stop chatting, Clem, just watch. My daughter's logged into my own account, spamming my own chat. So that's okay, Clemmy, just watch. Okay? I love you. So anyway, I never thought of this concept of like something that we might see as in a mysterious thing would be just our collective consciousness. And if that could be true, then, you know, right now we're all expressing our great childhood traumas. Okay? There's a lot of hurt people in this world. And I love you, Clemmy. Thank you. So, all this pain, for me, I think a lot of it has to do with the destruction of our families. And, you know, I want us to make the choice to be able to raise our families again, not have them be not having them be raised by others, not have them be trained and manipulated by others. And so that means I have to actually learn more. I have to grow up myself because I'm just a traumatized child. And I told my kids it's going to be a hard road. You know, and to some degree, we're going to be raising our expectations of things. But then the other side, we're going to have to lower some of them because we may have to make compromises. You know, we may not support certain things anymore. We may not do certain things anymore. So the path to being truthful has been really wonderful because I'm just discovering now how many lies I would tell to myself first and foremost. You know, anything that I ever did that I have regret for was all based in lies I was telling myself that I falsely believed. And so that's my road to growing up and to learning is to, you know, work hard and do everything that I can to go back and learn about other people's perspectives. Where are they coming from before I judge them? So, Clemmy, you're interrupting my stream. I am going to ask you one more time. Just close the door, hon. You can watch it from in there. She does want to be really involved, and I want to figure out how to do that. But I don't believe in exploiting children on public forums, so I'm trying to learn how to be more careful with that. But anyway, this talk has become a little disjointed, but the point is, maybe this collective consciousness is creating these things we're seeing. And there's just so much strangeness happening in the world right now. So for one thing, in Washington State today, there was a protocol put in place for active shooter situations, and they call it run, hide, fight. But these are just 3 words that indicate what people have been trained for, so they know what the situation is quickly. And so run, hide, fight made me think of, one, if it's a false alarm, but you're prepared. Okay, so I think a lot of these books, these stories that we've read, what do for us? Maybe they help soften the blow if this thing happens in real life. We're prepared, we know how to act. So I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about, the fact that we feel like we're under this psychological attack and we don't know what is true or not. And thinking about, a call to action, like from a movement that seeks, like, okay, we want to tell the truth, or we want to get information out to people. We want to get healthful, careful, good researched information out there to people. Where do we begin? But I think the problem is that we have a lack of good faith communication, and we don't really even know what this is. So I am going to read this article here soon called The Endgames of Bad Faith Communication. But basically, we've half solved the problem because we've identified the problem. The problem is in this communication style. And I am very guilty of a lot of the bad faith communication tactics. One being oversimplification. But I never am trying to promote that I know everything. Okay, this is like bullshitting, philosophizing, figuring things out. And I got to go skiing with my kids yesterday, and my mom and my sister and my niece. And overhear the different teaching styles of the instructors. And the one I liked the best, of course, was the man who said, "What's the difference between learning and knowing? To learn is to have a coach there with you, teaching you, and knowing is you try, you do." Okay, so that's my aim here, is to create the suitable environment for knowing. So we have to ask questions. We have to be able to admit we're wrong. And I'm all about that. And I don't want to jump on other people. I don't want to dehumanize them. And I don't think that's the way to build rapport with people, to try and convince them to your ways of thinking anyway. We have to be tactical about this, right? We're having all this stuff thrown at us. And how are we ever going to learn how to decipher it? So, it's hard now because we have to learn how to be honest and get over the fear of, like, when you're honest, people jumping all over you. That we just can't bark angrily at people to get them to change their minds. So we have to have kind and heartfelt messages that actually touch the hearts of others, right? And it's one thing to be rough around the edges, and there's space for that and we can use that as a tool in the toolkit, but that cannot be the whole thing. And I think we really confuse the idea of like our character and our personality as being this one thing. You know, we all have different aspects and different energetics from days to day, and what's happening in the world, it affects us differently, and what's happening in our lives and how we're eating and how we're sleeping and our water consumption, and all these things affect our moods and everything. So, you know, one thing skiing with kids teaches you is you have to have some patience, okay? Or else nobody's gonna have fun. Everybody's gonna be frustrated. Um, so yeah, it seems like we have to figure out how do we go about healing ourselves, our traumatic childhood experience, and then see that same traumatized child in someone else and have the space for that ability to build a rapport, because nobody's acting like they're the superior, you know. And sometimes those people attract us, like when we're attracted to the wrong person, and then they really damage us, but we still have like a jealousy if they get with somebody else, or we still have a ache, or that like we're still obsessed with them afterwards. It's because that trauma, we have not been able to deal with it. And so is it possible to come out of that? I hope so. I think I've made inroads that way. um so I'm gonna go and just go ahead and read this article explaining bad faith communication. There's a link to it if you'd rather read it yourself. Otherwise, stay tuned and listen to me. But if you're going to get off now, have a great night. We'll have some more fun talks tomorrow. And now, the endgames of bad faith communication. Seeking to understand others and communicate honestly is an essential democratic virtue. Can it be maintained in the digital age? This is from the consilienceproject.org. You can sign up for free and read their articles. Decades of culture war have degraded civic discourse, putting many open societies in a tailspin of bad faith public communications. Politicians, journalists, and everyday people on all sides intentionally mislead with facts, mischaracterize opposing views, and dehumanize those with whom they disagree. Social media has started to change our basic habits of communication by amplifying and incentivizing bad faith tactics. Every day, whole populations are exposed to powerful forms of computational propaganda and other manipulative information. Bad faith communication has become normalized. It is bad news for any society that values Bad faith communication has become normalized. This is bad news for any society that values and seeks to rely upon the uncoerced cooperation of its members. History tells us that the end games of society-wide communication breakdowns are catastrophic. When open communication cannot be used to resolve conflict and coordinate behavior, societies are driven toward chaos, war, oppression, and authoritarianism. Restoring public trust in good faith communications is possible, but it requires both a cultural shift towards civic virtues and a redesign of the technologies and social processes that structure civil discourse. People are being de-skilled in the art of good faith communication while refining skills in bad faith tactics. Despite the new normal of widespread bad faith communication, good faith communication is always already available to all parties. But the choice to engage in good faith is an especially difficult choice to make in today's culture. Powerful disincentives and barriers to making this choice have been put in place during many decades of escalating cultural conflict. Understanding why it has become so hard to engage in good faith communication is the first step towards shifting the cultural balance back in its favor. Communicating in good faith as a society requires that people take up certain skills and commit to shared values. These skills and values are generally not practiced and endorsed in most contexts of civic discourse today. People are instead being de-skilled in the art of good faith communication while refining skills in bad faith tactics. Good faith communication, a discourse oriented toward mutual understanding and coordinated action, with the result of increasing the faith that participants have in the value of communicating. Some signs of good faith communication: expressions of humility and curiosity, openings for changes in position based on new information, disagreements welcomed, group learning valued, steel manning the position of others, respect maintained during disagreement, sufficient time given to open discussion and other aspects of fair process, use of careful clarifications and evidence, attempts at finding shared base realities and values, emergence of new positions, integrations, and nuance. Note: all signs of good faith communication can be faked in bad faith. Bad faith communication: discourse that is intended to achieve behavioral outcomes, including consensus, agreement, and likes, irrespective of achieving true mutual understanding, with the result of decreasing the faith participants have in the value of communicating. Some signs of bad faith communication: expressions of hubris and lack of curiosity in opposing views, refusing changes in position based on new information, disagreements unwelcomed, consensus overstated, straw manning the position of others, disrespect included as part of disagreement, insufficient time and other aspects of unfair process, avoidance or omission of careful clarifications and evidence, no attempts to find shared base realities and values, emergence of stalemates, polarization, and simplifications. Note: all signs of bad faith communications can be disguised and denied. The situation has degraded to the point where it is widely believed that calls to good faith, such as this paper, are themselves acts of bad faith, undertaken only by those interested in controlling the discourse. Calls for good faith communication are understood at best as naive requests to calm the outrage and conflict that now runs rife in political discourse. Both ends of the political spectrum, the far left and the far right, express this view. Both sides believe that the other side simply can't be trusted and therefore cannot be engaged in good faith. To do so would be to fall into a trap, serving only to validate the dangerous views of groups known to be acting in bad faith. This stance of assuming the undesirability and sometimes impossibility of good faith communication sets off a spiral of mutual dismissal, distrust, and villainization. The only outcome of this dynamic is escalating cultural conflict and, eventually, physical violence. A growing awareness of this dynamic has political scientists and journalists worrying about increasing violent civil conflict within the United States. Others see the situation leading to some form of authoritarian control over public communications to secure social coordination by force. There should be no illusion. Today's culture war cannot be won by any side. All sides agree that in the absence of good faith communication, the last resort is some form of violence. Despite this knowledge, many still assert that it is actually unethical to engage the other side in good faith. The result is that people are earnestly doing something they believe to be right, refusing to engage in good faith with those they disagree with, which is nevertheless leading towards a result they do not actually want. Meanwhile, some parties actively seek to benefit from this dynamic, such as social media companies that leverage conflict for attention capture. The culture war, like most wars, is a source of profit and is therefore perpetuated despite the dangers. Given well documented advances in the field of information warfare, there should be no illusion. Today's culture war cannot be won by any side. Mutually assured destruction is now the name of the war game. The saturation of bad faith communication throughout culture is steadily increasing, like a kind of dangerous background radiation emitted from scientifically engineered mimetic weaponry. Public political discourse is quickly becoming a toxic war zone, leaching externalities into families, friendships, and identity structures. When institutions that depend on public distrust indulge in bad faith communications repeatedly, the legitimacy of these institutions declines. While insincere and manipulative communications have always been a part of human societies, our modern communications environment surpasses most recent historical periods in terms of the scale of its dysfunction. Comparisons may only be drawn with epochs characterized by failed states, civilizational collapse, and total war. A widespread inability to reach mutual understanding between members of the same society leads inevitably to social breakdown. When institutions that depend on public trust indulge in bad faith communications repeatedly, the legitimacy of these institutions declines. Unreliable communication compounds already complex social problems competing for citizens' limited attention, including ecological, economic, health, and education crises. Common strategies of bad faith communication: misleading with facts, presenting an argument containing factual information which is used intentionally to lead others to draw a conclusion that is not entirely accurate. White hat bias, presuming one's own moral and intellectual correctness, then using that assumption as righteous justification for communications that are intentionally deceptive and manipulative. Straw man arguments, presenting the arguments of opponents in their weakest forms, and after dismissing those, claiming to have discredited their position as a whole. Ad hominem dismissal, disparaging the character or person of others, and in so doing, acting as if this also invalidated their arguments. Moving the goalposts, establishing an agreed standard, criteria, or data for accepting others' views, but once this is not provided or met, the prior agreement is not mentioned, and a new standard is set. The reverse case also applies, i.e., when one cannot meet the agreed standards, these standards are forgotten and new ones are established. Sanctimony, acting as if oneself and or group is unquestionably morally superior and more intelligent than specific disagreeable individuals or groups, and thereby devaluing the members and delegitimating all views of that group. Appeals to authority, deeming that one's own authority, that of a favorite expert, or that of an associated institution definitively establishes positions currently being contested. Therefore, no further communication or explanation is needed, and the arguments of the disagreeable parties can be dismissed. Dehumanizing language, deploying language that characterizes groups as irredeemably unreasonable and not worthy of consideration, and thereby suggesting such groups should not be engaged in good faith. Undue social pressure, making arguments in ways that signal that disagreement will result in removal or disparagement from the in-group, as demands for behavioral conformity override the power of reason and evidence. This includes canceling, deplatforming, unfollowing, blocking, boycotting, trolling, etc. Pejorative representations, employing openly insulting and dismissive language when describing the person's ideas or practices of disagreeable groups, thereby justifying the discounting of their arguments without earnest consideration. Faking empathy and respect, pretending to feel empathy and respect for disagreeable others in a manner that undermines their actual experience and beliefs. Strawman empathy. Equivocations and false logics, engaging involved and detailed forms of argument that are nevertheless fallacious and misleading due to subtle and not so subtle logical mistakes such as strategically conflating and misusing terms, equivocation. Manipulative framing, using metaphors and emotional frames to lead preemptively to conclusions that are not fully suggested by the details of the argument. Villainization, creating the image of an anti-hero who epitomizes the worst of the disagreeable group and contrasts with the best qualities of one's own, then characterizing all members of the other group as if they were identical to that image. Oversimplification, intentionally focusing on only a few or the wrong variables when drawing conclusions about complex systems, while also dismissing as irrelevant or misleading the views of those seeking to include more variables for consideration. Complexity smokescreen, bringing an overwhelming amount of complex information to an argument and in so doing strategically downplaying a smaller, less complex set of variables that are actually more meaningful to the topic under discussion. In the wake of digital communication technologies, especially social media, manipulative information has become vastly more important. As demonstrated elsewhere, social media enables undue influence. What this means is that group membership established on social media can result in states akin to brainwashing, in which allegiance to the norms of the group and fear of ostracism cause extreme behaviors both online and offline. A post-truth culture is a culture of bad faith. A key feature of escalating extremism is a belief that group membership requires bad faith engagements without groups. In these contexts, bad faith behavior is often justified to maintain in-group membership and consensus. The normalization of bad faith communication contributes to the creation of extreme in-group pressures, which can rupture identities and exacerbate mental health crises. Personal instabilities usually lead to a doubling down on the need for group membership, increasing rationalizations and amplifications of bad faith practices. Digital media companies' business models result in a proliferation of increasingly niche group memberships. They also incentivize public displays of conflict and bad faith communication in order to capture attention and optimize engagement. Advertisements and propaganda dominate the social media space, driving up the total amount of bad faith communication to which people are exposed. In a very literal sense, heavy users of social media are being behaviorally entrained to engage disproportionately in bad faith communication. Politicians, public officials, and influencers of all kinds seek to exploit this environment of distrust and capitalize on the declining social value of good faith interactions. The epistemic commons is repeatedly degraded to the point of exhaustion. A post-truth culture is a culture of bad faith. This must stop if there is to be any future for open societies. Although there are many significant barriers to acting in good faith, they are surmountable given sufficient interest and willingness to seek cooperation and mutual understanding. If the desired outcome is sustainable, uncoerced social cooperation, which is what democracies strive to achieve, then willingness and interest must be found. The remedy for ongoing bad faith communication is not more bad faith communication. Good faith communication is both a complex skill and a value commitment that shapes personal identity. Excuse me. Oh. Good faith communication is both a complex skill and a value commitment that shapes personal identity. In other words, doing it is sufficiently difficult that getting good at it will change the kind of person that you are. But good faith engagement is often misconceived as a simple emotional stance, leading to an overzealous search for agreement. In part, this is because naive good faith interactions can often be based on an innocent orientation toward peacemaking and the avoidance of conflict. This can be seen in the good faith engagement of a child who does not know that some people are untrustworthy. Unskillfully engaging in good faith can be a danger when others are acting in bad faith. In some political discussions today, it is common to hear that you can't engage in good faith with Nazis. A generous interpretation of this statement is that there are truly unreasonable people who must not be trusted because they have proven themselves to be dangerous and unethical. But this is not an argument against good faith communication in general. It's an argument against engaging in naive forms of good faith in communication, which would play into the hands of those actively seeking to cause harm to others. Likewise, for those who have been lied to historically and treated with disrespect by specific groups, naively engaging with those same groups again in good faith would be foolish. Still, it remains true that under the conditions of contemporary society, the endgame of unrelenting and escalating bad faith communications is one in which everyone loses. The remedy for ongoing bad faith communication is not more bad faith communication. The risk of mutually assured destruction in the information wargame cannot be contained. The solution, therefore, appears to be necessarily drastic and unavoidably painful. Without a change in the current trends, authorities are increasingly likely to use force to secure ongoing social coordination. This includes increasingly overt censorship and the ideologically motivated disenfranchisement of dissidents. Avoiding social catastrophe will require the deployment of highly skilled, non naive good faith communication. This is a form of communication that seeks to increase for all parties their faith in the value of ongoing communication. Communicating in this way involves recognizing conflict and disagreement as real and important, unlike less skilled forms of good faith communication, in which conflict is judged to be bad and is diffused. The goal is to avoid the downward spiral of mutually reinforcing escalations of bad faith. Delicately transforming a situation of escalating bad faith requires the slow establishment of previously unrecognized shared interests, often on issues as basic as self-preservation. The goal in most cases is not agreement. That would be naive. The goal is simply to preserve the possibility of communication itself. More specifically, the goal is to act in ways that generate faith in the value of ongoing future communication. This is faith in a dynamic of communication that makes it possible to change positions, learn, and improve mutual understanding about essential shared realities. The risks of engaging in good faith can be mitigated. You can strongly disagree with someone in good faith, but this can only happen if you are in the right context while also being skillful and committed enough to do so. The only way to handle highly charged disagreements in good faith is to have social processes robust enough to hold them. Social media is demonstrably not adequate to this task. Neither are the legacy institutions, such as the judiciary, legislature, and election process, built by the architects of the modern nation state. Digital communications technologies make it possible new forms of democracy as well as new civic communications infrastructure supportive of the good faith exchange essential to open societies, but these possibilities remain unactualized. This is faith in a dynamic of communication that makes it possible to change positions, learn, and improve mutual understanding about essential shared realities. Designing technologies that enable good faith communication is not enough. Also required is a culture that emphasizes its values as a shared social good. Once underway, good faith communication creates a self reinforcing dynamic of mutual understanding, even during disagreements. That keeps open possibilities for learning and coordinated action. This is the reverse of the downward spiral of mutual distrust created by bad faith communication. Quick returns of social benefit result from investment in good faith communication across disagreements. And finally, even though most contexts do not currently support it, there is some personal responsibility that can be taken. Despite the escalating culture war, individuals can cultivate the skills of good faith communication and demonstrate its value as a social good. You can practice disagreeing in ways that maintain relational integrity and respect. Reflect on values. Notice bad faith tactics. Hold politicians, officials, journalists, your friends, and yourself to a higher standard of communication. To get started, you could consider the common strategies of bad faith communications mentioned above and practice the opposing strategies for good faith. But understand that highly skilled, non naive good faith communication cannot be made routine. There is not a formula or practice or technology that assures it, no, nor should there be. Any approach that becomes a recognized signal of good faith will then be faked in bad faith. Individuals must therefore continually innovate their approach to communication. We must work together always to find new ways to break the hegemony of bad faith. This should be done as if the future of civilization depends on it, because it does.